Some wounds never heal, they just get buried under years of silence and snow. For 50 years, Silas Boone carried the weight of losing his brother to betrayal and death. Now he lives alone in the mountains with just his dog Dusty for company. One cold morning, Silas finds a cave hidden behind an ice wall. Inside, there's a warm fire and something that changes everything. He discovers proof his brother might still be alive. All these years, Silas believed his brother was dead, but if he survived, why did he let Silas think otherwise? What really happened all those years ago? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm clock's shrill cry cut through the pre-dawn darkness at 4:30 sharp, same as it had every morning for the past 15 years. Silas Boone's weathered hand reached out from beneath the thick wool blankets, finding the clock's brass face with practiced ease. The cabin held that particular stillness that only comes in the deep mountain winter, when the world outside lies locked beneath 3 feet of snow, and the nearest neighbor sits 40 miles down a treacherous mountain road. Dusty stirred from his spot by the dying embers of the fire, his grizzled muzzle lifting as amber eyes tracked his master's movements. The old dog had been Silas's constant companion for 12 years now, found as a pup half frozen on the doorstep one November morning. Folks might say Silas saved the mutt, but truth was, Dusty had done the saving. In the years after Silas hung up his bounty hunter's badge and retreated to these remote peaks of the Bitter Ridge, the dog had been the difference between existing and truly living. The floorboards creaked their familiar song as Silas swung his legs over the edge of the bed, bare feet finding the cold pine planks. At 68, his body carried the accumulated weight of decades spent in hard country, a slight hitch in his left knee from a bullet that had found its mark in Arizona territory, permanent stiffness in his right shoulder from a wrestling match with a wanted man outside Dodge City. Yet his movements remained deliberate and strong, shaped by a lifetime of careful preparation and methodical habits. The morning ritual began as it always did. Silas struck a match and lit the kerosene lamp, its warm glow chasing shadows into the corners of the one-room cabin. The space was sparse but comfortable, built with his own hands from timber cut on his land. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth blackened by countless fires. Rough-hewn shelves held his few possessions, a handful of books, his father's, pocket watch, and a leather-bound journal where he recorded his daily observations of weather, wildlife, and the mountain's moods. He pulled on his clothes, wool long johns, heavy denim pants patched at the knees, a flannel shirt soft from years of wear. Over this went a thick woolen sweater knitted by a woman named Martha back in Billings, given to him the Christmas before he'd left civilization behind for good. The sweater still carried the faintest trace of her lavender soap, though he'd never told her why he couldn't stay, couldn't build the life she'd offered with such patient hope. The coffee pot sat ready from the night before, and Silas set it on the wood stove, adding kindling to coax the fire back to life. While the coffee heated, he opened his journal to a fresh page and recorded the date, February 15th, 1924. Outside, the wind carried that particular bite that promised fresh snow before nightfall. The barometric pressure had been dropping for 2 days. His old bones felt it like a coming storm. Dusty padded over and sat at Silas's feet, tail thumping against the floor. The dog had learned the rhythm of these mornings long ago. Coffee, then breakfast, then the daily check of the trap lines that provided their winter sustenance and small income. In his bounty hunting days, Silas had tracked men across 3 territories, bringing in desperados who thought they could disappear into the vast wilderness. Now he tracked fox and marten, creatures whose patterns he'd learned to read like scripture. The coffee finished brewing with a gentle gurgle, and Silas poured himself a cup, adding a splash of condensed milk from a can. He stood by the single window, looking out over the landscape that had become his world. The bitter ridge stretched in all directions, a maze of peaks and valleys where a man could lose himself completely or find himself, depending on what he was looking for. Snow covered everything in pristine white, broken only by the dark verticals of pine and fir trees. In the distance, Eagle's Crown Mountain rose like a cathedral spire against the grey sky. Somewhere out there, buried beneath the snow, lay the trap lines he'd set along ancient game trails. The work was honest and solitary, requiring patience and skill rather than the quick-draw reflexes that had once made him a name to be feared in certain circles. As he sipped his coffee, Silas's mind drifted to memories that surfaced uninvited on mornings like this. 48 years had passed since that terrible day in Canyon Springs, when his world had shattered like glass. His younger brother Thomas had been everything Silas wasn't: quick to laugh, generous with trust, blessed with an easy way that made folks warm to him instantly. They'd been partners in everything back then, from childhood adventures to their brief stint as lawmen in Colorado Territory. The betrayal had come from an unexpected quarter, or so Silas had believed all these years. A woman named Caroline Wells had arrived in Canyon Springs on the evening stage, claiming to be a school teacher looking for work. Pretty as a picture and sweet as honey, she'd caught Thomas's eye immediately. What followed had torn the brothers apart with a violence that still ached like an old wound on cold mornings. Silas shook his head, pushing the memories back into their deep vault. No good ever came from walking down that particular trail. Thomas was dead, had been for nearly 5 decades, and all the wondering in the world wouldn't bring him back or undo the choices that had destroyed their bond. The coffee finished, Silas prepared his breakfast. Flapjacks made from flour and milk, fried salt pork and eggs from the 3 hens he kept in a small coop behind the cabin. Dusty received his portion of the pork, tail wagging with enthusiasm that made Silas smile despite his melancholy mood. The dog's simple joy in life's small pleasures served as a daily reminder that happiness could be found in the most basic things. After breakfast, Silas donned his winter gear, heavy wool coat, thick gloves, and the wide-brimmed hat that had traveled with him across 2 decades of manhunting. His rifle, a Winchester Model 1894 that had never failed him, went into the saddle scabbard. Not that he expected trouble on the trap lines, but a man who'd lived as long as Silas had learned that trouble rarely announced itself ahead of time. The barn stood 50 yards from the cabin, a sturdy structure that housed his horse, a steady bay gelding named Thunder. At 15, the horse had earned his retirement from the hard work of carrying a bounty hunter across rough country, but he still enjoyed the shorter trips around the mountain property. Thunder nickered softly as Silas entered the barn, his breath visible in the cold air. Saddling the horse was another ritual, performed with the care of a man who'd learned that attention to detail could mean the difference between life and death. Every strap checked, every buckle secure. The saddlebags contained basic supplies: rope, extra cartridges, a small medical kit, and jerky for lunch. In his coat pocket, wrapped in oiled cloth, was the journal where he recorded the condition of each trap and noted animal sign. Dusty waited by the barn door, practically vibrating with excitement. These morning rides represented the highlight of his day, a chance to explore scents and sounds that spoke to something wild in his domesticated heart. Together, the 3 of them, man, horse, and dog, had covered hundreds of miles through these mountains, learning every creek bed and ridgeline, every hidden valley and forgotten trail. The first trap lay 2 miles north along a game trail that wound through a stand of lodgepole pines. As Thunder picked his way carefully through the snow, Silas found himself settling into the peaceful rhythm that made these solitary journeys restorative rather than lonely. The mountain air filled his lungs with crystalline purity, and the only sounds were the soft thud of the horse's hooves in snow and the occasional call of a mountain jay. This was the life he'd chosen after hanging up his guns, and most days it satisfied him completely. The violence and uncertainty of his bounty-hunting years had left him craving simplicity and peace. Here in the bitter ridge, He'd found both in abundance. The mountains didn't judge a man's past or demand explanations for the choices that had shaped him. They simply offered shelter to those wise enough to respect their power and humble enough to live by their rules. As they approached the first trap, Dusty bounded ahead through the snow, nose working furiously to decode the night's activities. Silas smiled at the dog's enthusiasm while scanning the area with practiced eyes. The tracks told a clear story. A fox had approached the trap during the night, but had detected something that spooked it before it could take the bait. Perhaps human scent lingering on the metal, or maybe just the animal's natural caution. He reset the trap with fresh bait, making mental notes for his journal. The morning stretched ahead with 10 more traps to check, each one a small puzzle to solve. It was honest work that connected him to the land and its creatures in ways his previous profession never had. Out here, success came through patience and understanding rather than speed and violence. Thunder stamped his feet impatiently, eager to continue their circuit. Dusty had already moved ahead to investigate a promising scent trail that wound between the trees. And Silas, sitting comfortably in the saddle that had carried him through so many adventures, felt the familiar contentment that came with being exactly where he belonged. The past might carry its burdens, but the present offered its own quiet rewards to a man wise enough to accept them. The morning had yielded 2 marten and a fox, a respectable take that would bring enough coin to keep him in supplies through the remainder of winter. Silas had worked his way through 8 of the 11 traps on his circuit when he noticed something that made him pull Thunder to a halt. Dusty, ranging ahead through the snow, had stopped suddenly and was staring at something beyond a cluster of ice-covered boulders. "What is it, boy?" Silas murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. In these mountains, anything unusual demanded careful attention. After 40 years of reading sign and tracking quarry, he'd learned to trust both his instincts and his dog's. Superior senses. Dusty whined softly, his ears pricked forward in that particular way that meant he'd found something interesting, but wasn't sure if it posed a threat. The dog took a few tentative steps forward, then looked back at Silas, as if seeking guidance. Whatever had caught his attention lay just beyond the rocky outcropping that formed a natural wall across the narrow valley. Silas dismounted and ground-tied Thunder, pulling his rifle from the saddle scabbard, more from habit than any real sense of danger. The snow here was deeper than usual, banked against the rocks by prevailing winds that had sculpted it into smooth, flowing curves. He followed Dusty's tracks toward the boulders, noting how the dog's paw prints showed increasing excitement as he'd approached whatever had captured his interest. The sight that greeted him defied immediate explanation. Behind the natural barrier of rocks, an ice wall rose 15 feet into the air, its surface smooth and blue-white like polished marble. That alone wouldn't have been particularly unusual. Ice formations were common enough in these mountains during the harsh winters. What stopped Silas in his tracks was the shimmer he could see deep within the frozen surface, a warm golden light that seemed to pulse with gentle rhythm. "Well, I'll be damned," he breathed, stepping closer to examine the phenomenon. The ice wall wasn't solid as it appeared from a distance. Behind the frozen surface, perhaps 6 feet back, lay what appeared to be a cave entrance. And from within that cave came the unmistakable flicker of firelight. Dusty had found a narrow gap at the base of the ice wall where snow had been melted and refrozen repeatedly, creating a passage just wide enough for a man to squeeze through if he was determined enough. The dog poked his nose into the opening, tail wagging furiously as warm air carried scents that spoke of human habitation. Silas knelt beside the gap, his mind racing through possibilities. The cave lay on his property, or at least what he'd always assumed was his property. These remote mountain boundaries had never been properly surveyed, and ownership often depended more on possession than paperwork. But in 15 years of living in the Bitter Ridge, he'd never encountered another soul this far from the main trails. The warm air flowing from the cave carried more than just the smell of wood smoke. There were other scents: coffee, cooked meat, and something else he couldn't quite identify. Someone was living in there, someone who'd found a way to survive the harsh mountain winter in what appeared to be considerable comfort. Silas's hand instinctively moved to the Colt revolver on his hip. Old habits died hard, and his years as a bounty hunter had taught him that hermits and mountain dwellers often preferred their solitude, for good reason. Men who hid this deep in the wilderness usually had something to hide from. He called out toward the cave entrance, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "Hello in there. My name's Silas Boone. I live about 5 miles south of here. Didn't know anyone else was in these parts." The response came immediately, the scrape of a chair across stone, followed by footsteps approaching the cave entrance. A voice called back, muffled by the ice but clearly audible. "That you, Silas? After all these years?" The words hit Silas like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs and setting his heart hammering against his ribs. That voice, older, roughened by decades of hard living, but unmistakable in its familiar cadence. It belonged to a ghost, a man who'd been dead for 48 years, Thomas. The name escaped his lips as barely a whisper. "It's me, brother. Thomas Boone, though I reckon I've got some explaining to do." Silas's legs suddenly felt unsteady beneath him. He pressed one hand against the ice wall for support, the cold burning through his glove. This couldn't be happening. Thomas had died in Canyon Springs in 1876, shot down in the street by a man named Jack Morrison. Silas had seen the body himself, had stood over his brother's grave as they lowered the pine box into the Colorado earth. "You're dead," Silas said, his voice stronger now, but filled with a confusion that bordered on panic. "I saw them bury you. I was there. I know how it must look, Silas. Hell, I know how it sounds. But if you can find your way through that gap, I'll tell you everything." Been waiting near 50 years for this conversation. Dusty had already wriggled through the opening and disappeared into the cave, his excited barking echoing off stone. Walls. The sound helped ground Silas in the present moment, reminding him that whatever impossible thing was happening, it was real. He could either stand here in the snow, wrestling with disbelief, or he could find out the truth. The gap was tight, requiring him to remove his heavy coat and push it ahead of him as he squeezed through the melted channel in the ice. The process was awkward and undignified, but within a few moments he emerged into a cavern that defied everything he thought he knew about survival in the high country. The cave was larger than it had appeared from outside, its natural walls smoothed by years of careful work. A fire burned in a stone-lined pit near the center, its smoke rising to disappear through cracks in the ceiling. Along one wall stood a rough table and 2 chairs, handmade but well-crafted. Shelves carved into the rock held supplies, tools, and personal belongings accumulated over decades of solitary living. And standing beside the fire, feeding wood to the flames with movements Silas remembered from childhood, was his brother Thomas, 50 years older, hair gone white and face carved by weather and hardship, but unmistakably the man who'd shared Silas's youth and shaped his understanding of loyalty and brotherhood. Thomas turned slowly, and their eyes met across the space of the cavern. The silence stretched between them, heavy with decades of grief, anger, and questions that had never found answers. Dusty, oblivious to the emotional weight of the moment, had discovered a bowl of water near the cave entrance and was drinking noisily. "You look good, Silas," Thomas said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "Mountain living agrees with you. You're supposed to be dead." The words came out harsh, accusatory. "I buried you myself. Stood at your graveside and swore I'd never forgive myself for what happened between us." Thomas nodded slowly, his weathered hands still feeding sticks to the fire. "I know. Had to be that way, at least for a while. Sit down, brother. This story's been 48 years in the telling, and I reckon it'll take some time to get through it properly." Silas remained standing, his body rigid with shock and the beginnings of anger. You let me think you were dead for half a century. You let me carry that guilt, that regret. Do you have any idea what that did to me? More than you know, Thomas replied quietly. More than you'll ever know. But there were reasons, Silas. Good reasons that I hope you'll understand once you hear them. Please, sit down. Let me tell you about Caroline Wells and what really happened in Canyon Springs. The mention of that name, the woman who'd come between them, whose lies and manipulations had destroyed their partnership and their bond, sent a chill through Silas that had nothing to do with the mountain cold. He moved to the second chair, on unsteady legs, his rifle forgotten in his grip. Outside, the wind had picked up, moaning through the ice wall that had hidden this impossible reunion for so many years. Inside the warm cave, two brothers faced each other across a chasm of time, betrayal, and carefully guarded secrets that were finally ready to see the light. Silas set his rifle against the cave wall and lowered himself into the chair, his movements careful and deliberate. The wooden seat, worn smooth by years of use, felt solid beneath him, an anchor point in a reality that had suddenly shifted beyond recognition. Dusty settled at his feet, sensing the tension between the two men and choosing the neutral ground. Between them, coffee? Thomas asked, gesturing toward a battered pot that sat warming near the fire's edge. Still make it strong, the way Papa taught us. The casual domesticity of the offer struck Silas as absurd, given the circumstances. Here was his dead brother, offering coffee as if they were simply catching up after a brief separation rather than confronting a deception that had lasted half a century. Yet something in Thomas's manner, the careful way he moved, the hesitant tone of his voice, suggested he understood the magnitude of what he was asking. "I'll take some," Silas replied, his voice hoarse. "But don't expect this to be some friendly reunion, Thomas. You've got explaining to do." Thomas poured 2 cups from the pot, the liquid dark and aromatic in the firelight. He handed one to Silas, their fingers brushing briefly during the exchange. The touch was electric, a confirmation that this wasn't some grief-induced hallucination or mountain fever dream. His brother, older, grayer, marked by decades of hard living, was flesh and blood real. "Where do I start?" Thomas asked, settling into his own chair. "With Caroline Wells, with Jack Morrison, with why I let you believe I was dead all these years?" "Start with Canyon Springs," Silas said. "Start with why you chose her over family, over everything we'd built together." Thomas stared into his coffee cup for a long moment, and when he looked up, his eyes held a pain that made Silas's chest tighten despite his anger. "I never chose her over you, brother. That's the first thing you need to understand. Everything that happened, the fight between us, my supposed death, all of it was part of something bigger than either of us realized at the time. Bigger. A how?" Silas's voice carried the skepticism born of too many lies from too many desperate men over the years. "You courted her. You defended her when I tried to warn you she was trouble. You threw 20 years of partnership away for a woman you'd known 3 weeks. Caroline Wells wasn't who she claimed to be," Thomas said quietly. "Hell, that wasn't even her real name. Took me years to piece together the truth, and by then the damage was done. By then you'd already buried an empty coffin and disappeared. Into these mountains." The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Silas felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the mountain air seeping through the cave entrance. "What do you mean, empty coffin?" Thomas reached into a wooden crate beside his chair and withdrew something wrapped in oiled leather. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a small leather journal bound with a faded ribbon. The cover bore the initials, C.W., stamped in gold letters that had dulled with age. "Found this in her hotel room after everything went to hell," Thomas explained. "Took me 3 months to work up the courage to read it. And when I did, it changed everything I thought I knew about what happened in Canyon Springs." Silas leaned forward, his anger momentarily displaced by curiosity. "What kind of journal?" "The kind that detailed a plan to destroy us both. Caroline Wells, her real name was Catherine Whitmore, was working for a man named Edmund Carlyle. You remember him?" The name hit Silas like a physical blow. Edmund Carlyle had been their last big capture, a railroad executive who'd embezzled nearly $50,000 from the Denver and Pacific line. They'd tracked him across 3 territories before cornering him in a brothel in Tucson. He'd sworn vengeance as they'd loaded him onto the prison wagon. But most criminals made similar threats. Neither brother had given his words much weight. He was in prison, Silas said, 20 years hard labor. He was also rich, connected, and patient as a spider in its web. According to the journal, he spent his first 2 years behind bars planning our destruction. Catherine was his cousin, raised in the same wealthy circles back east. She came to Canyon Springs with one purpose: to drive a wedge between us and destroy our reputation as bounty hunters. Thomas opened the journal to a page marked with a pressed flower, its petals brown with age. Listen to this entry, dated 3 days before our fight. Thomas suspects nothing. His devotion makes him predictable, while Silas's suspicion makes him dangerous. The plan proceeds as Uncle Edmund designed: turn the brothers against each other, then eliminate the threats they represent. Silas felt the world tilting around him. Eliminate the threats? Jack Morrison wasn't some drifter who took offense at my defending her honor. He was a hired gun, brought in specifically to kill me. The fight between us wasn't coincidence. It was orchestrated to separate us, to make sure you wouldn't be watching my back when Morrison made his play. The coffee had gone cold in Silas's hands, but he barely noticed. Memories of that terrible day came flooding back with new context. Details he'd dismissed at the time, now taking on sinister significance. Caroline's tears when Thomas had defended her against Silas's accusations. Her insistence that Thomas meet her alone at the hotel to discuss their future. The convenient timing of Morrison's arrival just as the brothers had reached the breaking point. You're saying she set us up, Silas said slowly, that the whole thing was a trap from the moment she stepped off that stage. She played us both, brother, but in different ways. She painted as jealous and controlling, poisoning my mind against your warnings. Me, she convinced that you were trying to sabotage my chance at happiness because you couldn't stand to see me with someone. Silas closed his eyes, remembering the harsh words they'd exchanged in the street outside the Silver Dollar Saloon. Thomas accusing him of jealousy, of trying to control his life. Himself responding with equal venom, calling Thomas a fool who'd throw away everything for a pretty face and sweet words. The crowd that had gathered to watch the Boone brothers tear each other apart with words that cut deeper than any blade. So what happened with Morrison? Silas asked. How did you survive? Thomas touched his left shoulder, and Silas noticed for the first time the way his brother favored that side when he moved. I didn't walk away clean. Morrison put 2 bullets in me before I managed to put one in him. Caroline was supposed to confirm my death and report back to her uncle, but something went wrong with their plan. What kind of something? You, Thomas said simply. You saw Morrison draw first, saw him shoot me down in what looked like cold blood. When you put 6 bullets in him before he hit the ground, it spooked her. She ran that same night, took the first stage out of town without staying to verify I was dead. Silas remembered that moment, the fury that had consumed him as he watched his brother fall, the speed with which he'd drawn and fired. Morrison had been fast, but grief and rage had made Silas faster. But I saw them bury you. You saw them bury a man about my size with his face shot away, probably by that scattergun Doc Henley kept behind the bar. Catherine needed a body for her report to Carlyle, and Doc needed to dispose of a drifter who died of pneumonia that same week. The revelation settled over Silas like a heavy blanket. Everything he'd believed about the worst day of his life was wrong. The guilt he'd carried, the self-imposed exile, the decades of regret, all based on a lie carefully constructed by people who'd wanted to destroy them both. Where were you? Silas asked. While I was grieving a brother who wasn't dead? Thomas gestured around the cave, his expression sad but resolute. Right here. Been here ever since, healing up and trying to figure out how to contact you without putting you in danger. By the time I was strong enough to travel, you'd disappeared completely. Took me 5 years just to learn you'd become a bounty hunter. Yourself, the silence that followed Thomas's words stretched between them like a chasm 48 years wide. Silas stared into the fire, watching the flames dance and flicker, while his mind struggled to process the enormity of what he'd learned. Everything he'd believed about himself, about his brother, about the defining moment of his life, had been built on carefully orchestrated lies. 5 years, he repeated finally. You knew where I was for 5 years and never reached out. Thomas shifted in his chair, and Silas caught another glimpse of the old injury that marked his left shoulder. By then you'd made a name for yourself. The ghost of the Rockies, they called you. Word was you could track a man across solid stone and draw faster than lightning. You were feared from Colorado to California. I was good at my job, Silas said quietly. Had to be. It was the only way I knew to honor what I thought we'd built together. That's exactly why I couldn't contact you, Thomas replied. Your reputation made you a target for every young gun looking to make his name. Adding the complication of a supposedly dead brother would have made things worse, not better. Besides, I had other problems to worry about. Silas looked up from the fire, noting something in his brother's tone that spoke of old fear. What kind of problems? Thomas stood and moved to one of the shelves carved into the cave wall, retrieving a small wooden box. Inside, wrapped in cloth, were a collection of yellowed newspaper clippings and handwritten letters. He brought the box back to his chair and began sorting through the contents. Edmund Carlyle got out of prison in 1883, Thomas said, handing Silas a newspaper clipping dated August 15th of that year. Served only 7 years of his 20-year sentence. Seems he had friends in high places willing to arrange an early release. Silas read the brief article announcing Carlyle's release, noting the mention of exemplary behavior and contributions to prison reform. It had the feel of a story written by someone who'd been paid to smooth over inconvenient details. Catherine's journal mentioned that he blamed us personally for his financial ruin. Thomas continued. Losing that 50,000 wasn't just about the money. It destroyed his reputation, cost him his position with the railroad, ruined his standing in Denver society. In his mind, we were responsible for the complete collapse of his life. So he decided to return the favor, Silas said, understanding beginning to dawn. With interest, Catherine's mission was just the opening move. When she failed to confirm my death, Carlyle assumed his plan had succeeded anyway. 2 brothers destroyed, one dead, the other consumed by grief and guilt. For a few years, that seemed to be enough. Thomas handed him another clipping, this one from 1885. The headline read, Notorious Bounty Hunter Dies in Montana Gunfight. Below it was a crude drawing that bore a passing resemblance to Silas, along with a story detailing the supposed death of the ghost of the Rockies in a shootout with cattle rustlers. That's when I knew he was still hunting us, Thomas explained. Someone had fed information to that newspaper, someone who wanted the world to think you were dead. When I saw that story, I realized Carlyle wasn't finished with his revenge. Silas studied the article, remembering the gunfight it described. He'd been in Montana that year, had indeed tangled with a gang of rustlers near Billings, but he'd walked away from that fight very much alive, something the newspaper account failed to mention. He was testing the waters, Silas realized, seeing if anyone would contradict the story. Exactly. And when no one did, when no friends or family came forward to dispute your death, he knew we were both isolated enough to be vulnerable. That's when the real hunting began. Thomas reached into the box again and withdrew a leather portfolio tied with string. Inside were more newspaper clippings, but these were different. Headlines about mysterious deaths, bounty hunters found dead under suspicious circumstances, lawmen who disappeared while pursuing routine cases. Took me 3 years to see the pattern, Thomas said. Men who'd worked with us, who'd known us, who might have been able to identify inconsistencies in our supposed deaths. One by one they started dying. Always looked like accidents or bad luck, but the timing was too convenient. Silas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain cold. Names and faces floated through his memory, fellow lawmen, informants, even the occasional criminal who'd provided useful information. How many of them had died because of their association with the Boone brothers? "Sheriff McKenna in Durango," Silas said, remembering a telegram he'd received in 1887. "Horse threw him, they said, broke his neck. McKenna was asking questions about your supposed death in Montana. Someone didn't like his curiosity. Thomas E. showed him another clipping. This one describing the sheriff's tragic accident in detail that seemed designed to discourage further investigation. Doc Henley from Canyon Springs died in a fire that burned down his clinic, Thomas continued, along with any records he might have kept about treating gunshot wounds or providing bodies for burial. The undertaker who handled my funeral died of food poisoning 2 weeks later. The scope of Carlyle's vengeance was becoming clear, and it was far more extensive than either brother had imagined. This wasn't just about destroying their partnership or even their lives. It was about erasing their entire existence, eliminating anyone who might contradict the official story of their deaths. "How many?" Silas asked. 17 that I could identify for certain, probably more that I missed or couldn't connect to us directly. Thomas's voice carried the weight of survivor's guilt that Silas recognized from his own dark nights of the soul. Dusty, who had been dozing by the fire, suddenly lifted his head and growled low in his throat. Both men froze, years of experience, telling them to trust the dog's superior senses. Outside the cave, barely audible through the ice wall, came the sound of horses moving through snow. Thomas was on his feet instantly, moving with the fluid grace of a man much younger than his. Years. He crossed to another shelf and retrieved a rifle, a newer model than Silas's Winchester, well-maintained and obviously ready for use. "Expecting company?" Silas asked, his own hand moving instinctively to his sidearm. "Been expecting it for 48 years, Thomas replied grimly. "Question is whether it's finally found me, or if it followed you here." The sound of horses grew closer, accompanied now by voices. At least 2 men, maybe 3. They were trying to be quiet, but their whispered conversation carried clearly in the thin mountain air. "Should have brought more men," one voice said. "3's enough for an old hermit," came the reply. "Besides, we're just supposed to confirm he's here and report back. Carlyle wants to handle this personally." Silas felt his blood turn to ice. Water. After nearly 5 decades, Edmund Carlyle's long-delayed vengeance had finally tracked them to the most remote corner of the Bitter Ridge. The brothers, who'd supposedly been dead for years, were about to face the man who'd orchestrated their destruction. Thomas checked his rifle's action with practiced efficiency. "Well, brother," he said quietly, "looks like our reunion's about to get complicated." The voices outside grew more distinct as the riders approached the ice wall. Silas counted at least 3 different speakers, their words carrying the casual confidence of men who believed they held all the advantages. He exchanged a look with Thomas, and in that moment, 48 years of separation and pain collapsed into the familiar rhythm they'd shared as younger men. The wordless communication of brothers who'd learned to trust each other's instincts. Above all else, Thomas pointed toward the back of the cave, where shadows suggested another passage. Silas nodded and quietly gathered his rifle, while Dusty remained alert but silent, sensing the need for stealth. Years of mountain living had taught the dog when to bark and when to become invisible. "Tracks lead right to this rock formation," one of the men was saying outside. "Fresh horse prints, maybe 2 hours old." "Could be anyone," replied a second voice, older and more cautious. "Trappers work these mountains all winter." "Not anyone," said the third man, his tone carrying the authority of leadership. "Those tracks match the description we were given. Big bay horse, distinctive gait from an old injury to the left front hoof. That's Thomas Boone's mount, or I'll eat my hat." Silas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cave's temperature. They'd been watching, studying, planning this approach for longer than today's discovery. The casual mention of thunders, slight limp, barely noticeable unless you knew what to look for, spoke of detailed surveillance over time. Thomas gestured for Silas to follow him toward the back passage, but before they could move, one of the men outside called out in a voice loud enough to carry through the ice wall. "Thomas Boone! We know you're in there! My name's Pike, and I work for an old friend of yours. Edmund Carlyle sends his regards and an invitation to discuss some unfinished business." The name Pike stirred something in Silas's memory, a reputation for efficient violence and complete loyalty to whoever paid his wages. If Carlyle had hired him, then this wasn't just reconnaissance. Pike was known for finishing jobs personally and thoroughly. "He's been looking forward to this conversation for a long time," Pike continued. "Nearly 50 years, in fact. Seems there's a debt that needs settling, and Mr. Carlyle is a patient man when it comes to collecting what's owed him." Thomas moved carefully to a position where he could see through a crack in the ice wall without exposing himself. He held up 3 fingers to Silas, confirming the number of men, then made a circling motion with his hand. They were spreading out, taking positions that would cover all possible escape routes. "Now you can make this easy or hard," Pike called out. "Easy means you come out peaceful-like, and we have ourselves a civilized conversation about old times. In Canyon Springs, hard means we come in after you, and civilized goes right out the window." Silas moved to Thomas's side, peering through another gap in the ice. He could see Pike now, a lean man in his 40s, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent his life in hard country. His companions were younger, but carried themselves with the confidence of experienced gunmen. All 3 wore heavy coats against the mountain cold, but their hands remained free and ready. "What do you think?" Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible. "I think Pike's never been known for keeping his word about civilized conversations," Silas replied. "And I think Carlyle didn't send him up here to chat about old times." Thomas nodded grimly. "Back passage leads to another entrance about a quarter-mile north. Steep climb, but it comes out behind a stand of pines that would give us cover. Can we reach it without them hearing?" "If we're careful. Cave goes back about 200 feet before it starts climbing. Sound doesn't carry well through the rock." Outside, Pike's patience was wearing thin. "I'm going to count to 10, Boone. Then we're coming in, and your brother Silas, oh yes, we know he's in there too, won't enjoy what happens next." The casual mention of his presence confirmed Silas's worst fears. This wasn't a chance encounter or even routine surveillance. Carlyle knew exactly who was in the cave and had planned accordingly. The old railroad man's network of information and influence stretched farther than either brother had imagined. "One?" Pike called out, his voice echoing off the surrounding rocks. Thomas was already moving toward the back of the cave, Dusty following silently at his heels. Silas gathered the leather journal and wooden box containing the evidence of Carlyle's long campaign of revenge. Whatever happened next, those documents represented the only proof of the conspiracy that had destroyed their lives. 2. The back passage was narrow and dark, requiring them to move single file with Thomas leading the way. He'd obviously traveled this route many times over the years, his movements sure and quiet despite the challenging terrain. Behind them, Pike's counting continued, each number bringing them closer to a confrontation that would end with either their escape or their deaths. 5. The passage began to slope upward, and Silas could feel cold air flowing down from somewhere above. Thomas had been right about the sound not carrying. Pike's voice was already fading to a distant murmur, but that also meant they wouldn't hear the men entering the cave until it was too late to matter. 8. They reached a natural chimney in the rock, a vertical shaft that rose into darkness above them. Thomas had driven iron spikes into the stone to create crude handholds, evidence of years spent preparing for exactly this kind of emergency. He began climbing immediately, Dusty tucked into a canvas sling across his back that had obviously been designed for this purpose. 10. Even through hundreds of feet of stone, they could hear the sharp crack of rifle fire as Pike and his men blasted through the ice wall. Shouts echoed from below as they discovered the empty cave, followed by the sounds of a thorough search. It wouldn't take them long to find the back passage, but by then the brothers would have precious minutes of head start. The climb was brutal, requiring them to ascend nearly 60 feet through a shaft barely wide enough for a man's shoulders. Silas's arms burned with the effort, and his breathing came hard in the thin air. But the alternative to completing the climb was facing Pike's guns with no room to maneuver, and that was no alternative at all. Thomas reached the top first and helped pull Silas up the final few feet. They emerged into daylight filtered through a screen of pine boughs, exactly as Thomas had promised. The trees provided excellent concealment while offering multiple escape routes through the dense forest. Below and behind them, angry voices echoed from the cave as Pike discovered their escape route. They went up the back shaft. "Collins, you stay here and watch the horses. Jenkins, you're with me. We're going after them." Silas looked at his brother, seeing the same grim determination in Thomas's eyes that he felt in his own heart. "How well do you know these mountains?" "Well enough," Thomas replied. "Question is, how well do they know them?" "Only one way to find out." Silas checked his rifle and began moving through the trees, Thomas and Dusty following close behind. After 48 years of separation, the Boone brothers were partners again, this time in a deadly game of survival against an enemy who'd waited half a century for his revenge. The pine forest offered both sanctuary and peril as the brothers moved through the deep snow. Each step had to be calculated, fast enough to stay ahead of their pursuers, quiet enough to avoid giving away their position. Thomas led the way with the confidence of a man who'd spent decades learning every trail, every hiding spot, every advantage these mountains could offer. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew steadily closer. Pike and his companion were making no effort at stealth, crashing through the underbrush with the determination of men who believed superior numbers and firepower would compensate for local knowledge. Their strategy was simple: push hard enough to prevent the brothers from disappearing entirely, then use their greater mobility to close the distance for a final confrontation. "There's a ridgeline about half a mile north," Thomas whispered as they paused behind a massive pine trunk. "Open ground, but it connects to a trail system that would let us lose them in the backcountry." Silas studied the terrain ahead, his tactical mind automatically calculating angles of fire, available cover, and escape routes. "They'll see us crossing the open ground. Pike's not stupid. He'll try to pin us down with rifle fire while his partner flanks us. Unless we give them something else to think about," Thomas replied, reaching into his coat to withdraw a small bundle wrapped in oiled cloth. Inside were 4 sticks of dynamite, old but carefully maintained, along with fuses and blasting caps. "Mining supplies?" Silas asked. "Found a played-out silver claim about 3 miles west of the cave. Previous owner left behind enough explosives to bring down half the mountain, if a man knew how to use them properly." Thomas's smile held no warmth. "Figured they might come in handy someday." The sound of approaching footsteps forced them to move again, deeper into the forest where the trees grew thicker and the snow lay in deeper drifts. Dusty ranged ahead, his natural camouflage and silent movement making him nearly invisible among the shadows. Twice the dog froze and looked back, warning them of danger before melting back into the undergrowth. They reached the edge of the open ground Thomas had described, a natural meadow perhaps 200 yards across, flanked by steep slopes on either side. The snow here was pristine and deep, marked only by the tracks of deer and smaller game. Crossing it would leave an obvious trail, but the alternative was doubling back toward their pursuers. "How stable is the slope on the east side?" Silas asked, studying the steep incline that rose above the meadow. Thomas followed his gaze and nodded slowly. "Snow's been building up there all winter. Probably ready to come down with the right encouragement." "Think your mining supplies could provide that encouragement?" One way to find out. Thomas began preparing the dynamite, cutting fuses to different lengths with practiced efficiency. You ever trigger an avalanche before? No, but I've seen what they can do. In Colorado, watched one take out a whole mining camp. Key is timing. Too early, and we just give them a light show. Too late, and we're caught in it ourselves. The voices of their pursuers were getting closer, Pike's harsh commands carrying clearly through the cold air. Trail leads straight to that. In clearing, they'll have to cross it or double back on us. Jenkins, you take the high side. I'll cover the low ground. Silas felt the familiar calm that had served him through dozens of dangerous situations as a bounty hunter. His mind cleared, focusing on the immediate tactical problem while pushing aside the emotional complications of fighting alongside his supposedly dead brother. Give me 2 minutes to get into position on the far side. When you see me wave, start. Your countdown. Thomas handed him one of the prepared charges. If this goes wrong, it won't go wrong, Silas interrupted. We've done harder things with worse odds. That was a long time ago, brother. Some things you don't forget. Silas checked his rifle one more time, then began moving around the edge of the clearing, using the tree line for cover. The snow was treacherous here, soft enough to muffle his footsteps, but deep enough to slow his progress. Behind him, he could hear Thomas explaining the plan to Dusty in the quiet voice he'd always used with animals. Reaching the far side of the meadow took longer than expected, but Silas finally found a position that offered both cover and a clear view of the slope where Thomas would place his charges. The dynamite would need to be positioned carefully, high enough to trigger a significant slide, but not so high that the brothers couldn't escape the avalanche zone in time. A flash of movement caught his eye as Pike emerged from the forest on the opposite side of the clearing. The gunman moved with professional caution, rifle ready, eyes scanning constantly for threats. His partner, Jenkins, appeared higher up the slope, exactly as Thomas had predicted. They had the brothers' trail in sight and were preparing to close. The trap. Silas raised his arm and waved once, then took aim at a position about 20 yards from where Pike stood. If everything went according to plan, he wouldn't need to fire a shot. But plans had a way of going wrong when bullets started flying, and it was always better to be prepared. Thomas appeared briefly at the edge of the tree line, 2 bundles of dynamite in his hands. He moved with surprising speed for his age, scrambling up the loose rock and snow to reach the optimal placement point. Pike spotted him immediately and raised his rifle, but the angle was wrong for a clear shot. "There he is!" Pike shouted to his partner. "On the slope! Take him!" Jenkins tried to adjust his position for a better shot, but the steep terrain made movement difficult. Thomas reached his target location and began setting the charges, working with the calm efficiency of a man who'd done this kind of work before. The fuses were already lit, thin trails of smoke rising into the cold air. "What the hell is he doing?" Jenkins called out, finally recognizing the danger. Pike understood first. "Avalanche! Get back now!" But it was too late. Thomas was already sliding down the slope away from the charges, using his rifle as a makeshift brake to control his descent. The first explosion echoed across the meadow like thunder, followed immediately by the second. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the entire eastern slope began to move. The avalanche started slowly, a few loose rocks tumbling down the incline, but within seconds it became a roaring wall of snow, stone, and broken trees that swept everything before it. Jenkins screamed once before disappearing beneath the cascade, while Pike ran desperately for higher ground that seemed to remain just beyond his reach. Silas pressed himself against a large boulder as the avalanche swept across the meadow, filling the air with flying debris and a noise like the end of the world. Snow and rock crashed through the trees around him, but his position on the far slope kept him clear of the main slide. When the thunder finally stopped, an eerie silence settled over the transformed landscape. Where the meadow had been, a field of broken rock and compacted snow now stretched for hundreds of yards. Pike was nowhere to be seen, though whether buried or simply driven back into the forest was impossible to tell. Thomas appeared from the tree line, coated with snow but apparently unharmed. Dusty bounded through the debris field toward Silas, tail wagging as if this had all been an elaborate game. For the moment at least, they were safe, the silence following. The avalanche felt unnatural, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. Silas picked his way carefully across the debris field toward where Thomas waited. Dusty, having already reached his brother, and received the customary scratch behind the ears that confirmed everyone had survived the ordeal. "Pike?" Silas asked. As he approached, Thomas shook his head, pointing toward a section of the slide where fabric and leather protruded from beneath tons of snow and rock. "Found what's left of Jenkins over there. Pike either got buried deeper or made it back to the trees before the slide hit." They stood together surveying the destruction, both men understanding that while they'd won this particular battle, the war was far from over. Carlyle wouldn't have sent only 3 men to handle a job he'd been planning for nearly 5 decades. Pike and his companions had been scouts sent to confirm the brothers' location and assess their defenses. "We need to get to your cabin," Thomas said. "Gather supplies and figure out our next move before—" He stopped mid-sentence, his face going pale as he stared at something beyond Silas's shoulder. Following his brother's gaze, Silas turned to see a lone figure emerging from the tree line on the opposite side of what had been the meadow. The man moved with the careful steps of someone navigating treacherous terrain, but there was nothing uncertain about his purpose. Even at this distance, Edmund Carlyle was instantly recognizable. 73 years old now, his hair white as the surrounding snow, but still carrying himself with the arrogant bearing that had made him so many enemies during his railroad days. He wore a heavy fur coat that spoke of wealth and comfort, and the rifle in his hands looked both expensive and well-maintained. "Impressive display, gentlemen," Carlyle called out, his voice carrying clearly across the transformed landscape. "Though I must say, you've caused me considerable inconvenience. Do you have any idea how difficult it is to find reliable help in these remote mountains?" Silas felt his hand move instinctively toward his sidearm, but Thomas caught his wrist. "He's not alone," his brother murmured. "Look at the tree line." Now that he knew what to search for, Silas could see them. At least 4 more men positioned among the pines, their rifles trained on the brothers' position. Carlyle had anticipated the possibility of an ambush and had come prepared accordingly. "I've been looking forward to this conversation for a very long time," Carlyle continued, beginning to pick his way carefully across the debris field. "Nearly 50 years, in fact. You gentlemen cost me everything I'd worked my entire life to build." "You cost yourself everything when you decided to steal from the railroad," Silas called back. "We just did our job." Carlyle's laugh was brittle as winter ice. "Your job? Your job was to bring me in alive to face trial. Instead, you destroyed my reputation, my business relationships, my standing in society. Even after I served my time, far more time than the crime warranted, the stigma followed me everywhere." Thomas stepped forward slightly, his rifle held ready but not yet aimed. "So you decided to destroy us in return, turn us against each other, fake my death, eliminate anyone who might contradict your story." Ah, Thomas, still alive after all. These years, Catherine will be so disappointed. She was quite proud of her performance in Canyon Springs. Though I suppose she can take comfort in knowing that her work accomplished its primary objective. "Which was what exactly?" Silas asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "To isolate you both. To strip away your support network, your reputation, your very identity. Thomas became a dead man, forgotten by history. You became a ghost, feared and shunned by the very communities you once served. Neither of you ever again posed a threat to my interests or anyone else's." The casual cruelty in Carlyle's voice sparked something dangerous in Silas's chest. This man had orchestrated the destruction of their lives with the same cold calculation he'd once applied to railroad schedules and freight manifests. Everything they'd lost, everyone who died because of their association with the Boone brothers, had been nothing more than entries in Carlyle's ledger of revenge. "But you're both here now," Carlyle continued, still approaching across the treacherous footing. "Together again, just as you were in the old days. And that presents me with a unique opportunity, the chance to finish what Catherine started, but to do it properly this time." Thomas raised his rifle, the barrel swinging. "Toward Carlyle." "That's close enough." "Oh, I don't think so." Carlyle smiled and raised his hand in a signal to his hidden men. "You see, gentlemen, I've learned from my previous mistakes. This time, I'm not relying on hired help or elaborate deceptions. This time, I'm handling things personally." The crack of rifle fire echoed across the avalanche site, but it didn't come from Carlyle or his men. Instead, it came from behind the brothers, from a position they'd assumed was secure. Silas spun around to see a figure rising from behind a fallen log. Pike, very much alive and apparently unhurt, his rifle smoking from the shot he'd just fired. The bullet had found Thomas, spinning him around and sending him crashing to the snow-covered rocks. Blood spread quickly across his heavy coat, dark against the white fabric. Dusty rushed to his fallen master, whining with distress as he tried to understand what had happened. "Thomas!" Silas dropped to his knees beside his brother, pressing his hands against the wound in a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding. The bullet had taken Thomas high in the chest, perhaps missing his heart, but definitely causing serious damage. "Excellent work, Pike," Carlyle called out approvingly. "Though I specifically requested that you take them both alive." "Old habits," Pike replied, emerging fully from his concealment. Snow and debris covered his coat, and blood trickled from a cut on his forehead, but he was mobile and dangerous. "Besides, one dead and one captured serves your purposes just as well." Thomas gripped Silas's arm with surprising strength, his eyes urgent despite the pain. "The journal," he whispered. "Don't let him get the journal." Silas understood. The leather-bound record of Catherine's mission represented the only proof of Carlyle's conspiracy. Without it, their deaths would simply be another unsolved mystery. In the remote mountains, two hermits who'd met an unfortunate end during a harsh winter. "Very touching," Carlyle said, having reached speaking distance despite the difficult terrain. "The legendary Boone brothers, reunited at last. Though I must say, Thomas, you're looking rather poorly. Perhaps we should put you out of your misery before we proceed with our business." "Go to hell," Thomas managed through gritted teeth. "I've been there, my friend. Prison is its own special version of hell, and you sent me there for 7 years of my life. Now it's your turn to experience some suffering." Carlyle gestured to Pike, who began moving to flank Silas's position. The other gunmen were emerging. From the tree line now, their rifles trained on the brothers to prevent any desperate moves. The trap was closing with mechanical precision, 48 years in the making. But as Pike approached, Dusty suddenly launched himself from beside Thomas's. Prone form, the dog hit the gunman in the chest with 60 pounds of furious loyalty, sending them both tumbling across the rocky debris. Pike's rifle went flying, and for a moment the carefully orchestrated endgame dissolved into chaos. Silas seized the opportunity, rolling away from Thomas while drawing his Colt in one fluid motion. The revolver bucked in his hand as he put 2 shots into the nearest of Carlyle's men, then dove for cover behind a boulder as return fire sparked off the rocks around him. "Kill them both!" Carlyle screamed, his calm demeanor finally cracking. "I don't care about questioning them anymore. Just finish this!" The battle that followed would be brief but decisive, fought among the debris of an avalanche that had been meant to solve their problems, but had instead created new ones. And somewhere in the chaos of gunfire and shouted commands, the truth about Canyon Springs would either be preserved or die with the brothers who'd carried it for so many years. The gunfight erupted with the sudden violence of a thunderstorm, muzzle flashes lighting up the grey afternoon as bullets sparked off rocks and splintered the few remaining trees. Silas pressed himself against the boulder that provided his only cover, acutely aware that his position was far from ideal. He had perhaps 20 rounds for his rifle and 6 in his Colt, not nearly enough to fight his way out against 5 armed men with superior positioning. Pike had managed to throw off Dusty's attack, but not without cost. The dog's assault had left the gunman with deep gashes on his gun arm, and his rifle lay somewhere among the scattered debris. He was reduced to his sidearm, which evened the odds slightly, but not enough to matter in the long run. Thomas remained where he'd fallen, one hand pressed against his chest wound, while the other fumbled for his own rifle. Blood continued to seep between his fingers, but his eyes remained alert and focused. In a voice barely audible above the gunfire, he called out to his brother, "Silas, the charges!" At first, the words made no sense. Then Silas remembered. Thomas had prepared 4 sticks of dynamite, but had only used 2 to trigger the avalanche. The remaining explosives were still in his brother's coat pocket, and that gave them options that Carlyle's men couldn't anticipate. "Can you reach them?" Silas called back, snapping off a shot at one of Carlyle's men who'd tried to advance across the debris field. Thomas managed a weak nod, his uninjured hand moving carefully toward his coat. The motion drew fire from 2 different directions, bullets whining off the rocks around him, but he continued his slow, determined effort to reach the remaining dynamite. Carlyle himself had taken cover behind a massive pine tree on the edge of the avalanche zone, well back from the immediate fighting but close enough to direct his men's movements. His voice carried clearly as he shouted orders with the authority of a man accustomed to command. "Fletcher, work your way around to the left. Morrison, keep them pinned down from the high ground. Pike, stop bleeding on my mountain and finish what you started." The casual reference to my mountain struck Silas as revealing. Carlyle wasn't just here for revenge. He'd somehow acquired legal claim to this territory, which explained how he'd been able to position his men so effectively. The old railroad man had been planning this confrontation down to the smallest detail. Pike was indeed trying to finish what he'd started, working his way closer to Thomas's position while using the scattered boulders for cover. His wounded arm made his movements awkward, but he was still dangerous, still determined to complete his mission. Dusty had retreated to Thomas's side, growling at any movement that brought enemies closer to his fallen master. The man Carlyle had called Fletcher was attempting the flanking maneuver, moving with professional competence across the treacherous terrain. Silas recognized the type, an experienced gunman who understood that rushing into a fight was the fastest way to get killed. Fletcher would take his time, find the perfect position, then end the battle with a single well-placed shot. Silas's tactical mind raced through their dwindling options. The boulder that sheltered him offered protection from 3 directions, but Fletcher's flanking movement would soon expose his position from the left. Thomas was wounded and immobile. Pike was closing in despite his injuries, and Morrison commanded the high ground with what appeared to be a scoped rifle. The situation was desperate, but desperation had a way of clarifying a man's thinking. Silas had survived 20 years as a bounty hunter by making hard choices under impossible circumstances. This was just another impossible circumstance, albeit one that carried more personal stakes than any he'd faced before. "Thomas," he called, out during a brief lull in the firing. "How long on those fuses?" 30 seconds, Thomas replied, having finally managed to extract the remaining dynamite from his coat. "But I can't throw them far enough from here. Need to get closer to their positions," which meant one of them would have to leave cover, cross open ground under fire, and somehow survive long enough to place the charges where they do the most good. Given Thomas's condition, that responsibility fell to Silas, a fact that both brothers understood without discussion. Silas checked his ammunition supply again, confirming what he already knew. He had perhaps a dozen rounds left between rifle and revolver, barely enough to provide covering fire for his own advance, much less to win a sustained firefight. But the dynamite changed everything if he could get close enough to use it effectively. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was about to attempt something that would have been unthinkable just hours earlier. placing his life in his brother's hands after 48 years of believing Thomas was dead. But trust, once established between brothers, apparently survived even decades of separation and pain. "Light the fuses," Silas said, his voice carrying the calm certainty of a man who'd made his peace with long odds. "Give me 30 seconds, then send them toward Carlyle's position." Thomas struck a match with hands that trembled only slightly despite his injuries. "Silas, this is suicide. Even if you reach them, you'll never make it back to cover." "Maybe not, but staying here is certain death for both of us." Silas chambered a round in his rifle and prepared for what might be his final charge. "Besides, I owe you 48 years of conversations we never had. Seems like a fair trade." The fuses caught and began their steady burn toward the blasting caps. Thomas held the dynamite carefully, timing his throw to coordinate with his brother's desperate gambit. In the distance, Fletcher had almost completed his flanking movement, while Pike continued his methodical advance from the opposite direction. Silas took a deep breath, centering himself in the moment the way he'd learned to do before every dangerous arrest. Fear was a luxury he couldn't afford. There was only the target, the distance to cover, and the actions required to reach his goal. Everything else was distraction. "Now," he whispered, and launched himself from behind the boulder. The reaction was immediate and violent. Every gun on the mountainside opened fire at once, filling the air with lead and the sharp crack of rifle. Reports. Silas ran in a weaving pattern that made him a difficult target while still allowing him to return fire, his rifle bucking in his hands as he snapped off shots at anything that moved. Fletcher appeared from behind a fallen tree, rifle rising to his shoulder for what should have been an easy shot at the charging man. But Silas had anticipated the movement, and his bullet took Fletcher in the chest before the gunman could complete his aim. The man pitched backward into the snow, his rifle clattering away across the rocks. Morrison, shooting from the high ground, had better luck. His bullet burned across Silas's left shoulder, spinning him around and nearly sending him tumbling across the debris field. But momentum and desperation kept him on his feet, kept him moving toward Carlyle's position, where the old man waited with cold satisfaction. Pike had broken cover as well, limping rapidly across the open ground in an attempt to intercept Silas before he could reach his target. The wounded gunman's pistol barked repeatedly, shots going wide in his haste, but coming close enough to remind Silas that death was only inches away. Behind him, Thomas lobbed the first stick of dynamite in a high arc that would bring it down, near Morrison's elevated position. The fuse was burning fast now, perhaps 10 seconds remaining before the explosion would reshape the battlefield once again. Silas reached the edge of the debris field and dove for cover behind the same fallen log that had concealed Pike earlier. Bullets tore through the air where he'd been standing, but for the moment he was safe. More importantly, he was within 20 yards of Carlyle's position, close enough to end this decades-old conflict once and for all. Carlyle himself seemed to recognize the shift in momentum. The old man's voice had lost its commanding tone, becoming sharp with something that might have been fear. "Morrison! Where the hell is Morrison? Pike, stop that man before—" The first explosion cut off his words. A sharp crack followed by screams from the high ground where Morrison had been positioned. Thomas's aim had been true despite his injuries, and the avalanche had claimed another of Carlyle's men. Silas used the distraction to advance on Carlyle's position, his rifle empty now, but his Colt still loaded with 5 rounds. The old railroad man saw him coming and tried to bring his own weapon to bear, but age and panic made his movements clumsy. The rifle wavered in his hands as he struggled to draw a bead on his approaching nemesis. 48 years, Silas said, his voice carrying across the 20 feet that separated them. 48 years you've been hunting us. Time to finish what you started. Carlyle's face was pale with rage and fear, but his voice remained defiant. You destroyed my life, everything I worked for, everything I built. You destroyed your own life when you started stealing. We just brought you to account for it. The old man's rifle finally steadied, its barrel swinging toward Silas with deadly intent. But before he could fire, the second stick of dynamite exploded somewhere behind them, and Pike's scream of agony suggested that Thomas's second throw had also found its mark. In that moment of distraction, Silas made his final move, closing the distance between himself and the man who'd orchestrated their decades of suffering. The confrontation that had begun in Canyon Springs 48 years earlier was finally reaching its inevitable conclusion. The final 20 feet between Silas and Edmund Carlyle stretched like an eternity, each step bringing him closer to the confrontation that had been 48 years in the making. The old railroad man's rifle wavered in his hands, fear and age conspiring to rob him of the steady aim that might have ended everything in his favor. "You should have stayed dead," Carlyle snarled, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Both of you should have stayed dead and buried in Canyon Springs, where you belonged." Silas's Colt was in his hand, though he didn't remember drawing it. The familiar weight of the weapon grounded him in the moment, its balance as natural as breathing after decades of relying on its deadly accuracy. Time seemed to slow, as it always did in these crucial seconds, the world narrowing to the simple equation of distance, angles, and reflexes that would determine who walked away alive. "We're not the ones who belong in the ground," Silas replied, his voice carrying the calm certainty of a man who'd faced death too many times to fear it now. "That honor belongs to the man who spent 50 years destroying innocent lives for his own twisted revenge." Carlyle's rifle bucked as he fired, but panic and desperation ruined his aim. The bullet went wide, chipping bark from a pine tree 20 feet to Silas's left. Before the old man could work the bolt and chamber another round, Silas's Colt spoke once with its familiar thunder. The .45 caliber bullet took Edmund Carlyle in the center of his chest, punching through his expensive fur coat and the equally expensive hatred that had sustained him through decades of careful planning. The impact lifted him off his feet and sent him sprawling backward into the snow, his rifle flying from nerveless fingers to land among the scattered debris of the avalanche. For a moment, the mountain fell silent, except for the wind sighing through the pines and the distant sound of Thomas calling his brother's name. Silas approached Carlyle's fallen form cautiously, his weapon still trained on the old man's chest. Too many supposedly dead enemies had taught him the value of wariness, even in apparent victory, but Carlyle was finished. Blood frothed on his lips as he struggled to speak, his pale eyes fixed on Silas with a mixture of hatred and something that might have been respect. You always were. Faster than I gave you credit for," he wheezed. "Fast enough," Silas replied, holstering his revolver. "Should have left us alone, Edmund. Should have served your time and built a new life instead of trying to destroy ours." "New life?" Carlyle's laugh was bitter as winter wind. You think it was ever about the money? About prison?" He coughed, and more blood stained the snow beneath his head. "It was about the humiliation, the shame, being brought down by two ignorant mountain boys who thought they were heroes." Silas felt a deep weariness settle over him as he looked down at the dying man. All those years of suffering, all those innocent people killed, all because one man's pride couldn't accept the consequences of his own choices. "We were never heroes, Edmund. We were just men trying to do our jobs." "Job." Carlyle's voice was fading now, his breathing becoming labored. "My job was building civilization in this wilderness. Your job was destroying everything I built." "Your job was stealing from the people who trusted you," Silas corrected. "My job was bringing you to justice. The fact that you couldn't accept that justice says more about you than it does about us." Carlyle tried to respond, but the words dissolved into a wet cough that brought up more blood than air. His eyes remained fixed on Silas's face, burning with undiminished hatred even as life ebbed away. When the end finally came, it was with a shuddering breath that carried away 48 years of carefully nurtured vengeance. Silas stood over the body for a long moment, feeling neither satisfaction nor regret. Edmund Carlyle had orchestrated his own destruction as surely as he'd orchestrated theirs, and justice, delayed but not denied, had finally claimed its due. The man who'd spent half a century playing God with other people's lives had discovered that even gods could bleed and die. Behind him, Thomas was calling his name with increasing urgency. Silas turned from Carlyle's corpse and hurried back across the debris field, suddenly remembering that his brother had been shot and was losing blood while Silas had been settling old scores. He found Thomas propped against a boulder, one hand still pressed against his chest wound, while the other held Dusty close for comfort. The dog's fur was matted with his master's blood, but his tail wagged weakly when he saw Silas approaching. "Is it finished?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above. A whisper. "It's finished," Silas confirmed, kneeling beside his brother to examine the wound. "Carlyle's dead, and I don't think any of his men survived your dynamite demonstration." Thomas managed a weak smile. "Always did have a talent for making things go boom." The bullet had taken him high in the left side of his chest, missing his heart, but possibly puncturing a lung. Blood continued to seep steadily from the wound, despite the pressure he was applying, and his skin had taken on a greyish pallor that spoke of serious blood loss. "We need to get you to a doctor," Silas said, though they both knew the nearest medical help was at least 40 miles away across treacherous mountain terrain. "Too far," Thomas replied, reading his brother's thoughts. "Too much blood lost already." Silas felt the weight of cruel irony settling over him. After 48 years of separation, after surviving Carlyle's long campaign of revenge, after finally learning the truth about Canyon Springs, he was going to lose his brother again. This time, for real. Silas tore strips from his own shirt, working with the desperate efficiency of a man who'd patched too many wounds in too many desperate situations. The makeshift bandages might slow the bleeding, but they couldn't repair the damage Pike's bullet had done to Thomas's chest. Still, he had to try. After losing his brother once to lies and deception, he wasn't prepared to lose him again to a gunman's bullet. "Hold still," Silas murmured, as he packed the wound as best he could with the limited supplies available. "I'm going to get you back to the cabin. We'll figure out the rest from there." Thomas gripped his brother's wrist with surprising strength, his eyes urgent despite the pain that was clearly consuming him. "Silas, listen to me. There's something else you need to know about Catherine, about what really happened in Canyon Springs." "Save your strength," Silas replied, but Thomas shook his head with stubborn determination. "No time for that. The journal, it doesn't tell the whole story. Catherine, she wasn't just working for Carlyle, she was—" Thomas coughed and blood flecked his lips. "She was his daughter." The words hit Silas like a physical blow. His daughter, illegitimate, born to a woman Carlyle kept in St. Louis while he was married to someone else. Raised her himself after her mother died, filled her head with stories about how the world owed them both something for the hardships they'd endured. Silas felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with sickening clarity. Catherine's easy manipulation of both brothers, her intimate knowledge of their habits and weaknesses, the personal hatred that had driven her performance in Canyon Springs. It all made sense now. "She knew us," Silas said slowly. "Before she ever came to town, she knew us. Carlyle had been planning our destruction for months, maybe years. Catherine studied us the way a hunter studies his prey. She knew exactly which buttons to push, exactly how to drive us apart." Thomas's breathing was becoming more labored, each word an obvious effort. But he continued with the determination of a man who needed to unburden himself of secrets he'd carried too long. "The worst part is, I think she actually came to care for me. Not enough to abandon the plan, but enough to feel guilt about what she was doing. There are entries in her journal, later ones, where she talks about wishing things could have been different. Doesn't matter now, Silas said, though part of him wondered if it might have mattered then, if they'd known the truth. She made her choices. We all made choices, brother. Some of them were the right ones, some weren't. But the one thing I never doubted, even when we were at each other's throats in Canyon Springs, was that you were trying to protect me. I was too proud and too stubborn to see it then, but I see it now. Dusty whined softly and nuzzled closer to Thomas, as if sensing that something precious was slipping away. The dog's simple devotion served as a reminder of the bonds that truly mattered. Loyalty given freely, without calculation or hidden agenda. I need you to promise me something, Thomas continued, his voice growing weaker. The cave, it's got supplies enough to last through the winter. Documents too, things that prove what Carlyle did to all those people over the years. Don't let that die with me. You're not dying, Silas said automatically, though he could see the truth in his brother's increasingly pale face. We're going to get you patched up and... Silas. The single word carried enough authority to cut through denial and false hope. We both know better. I've been living on borrowed time for 48 years anyway. At least now I get to spend my last minutes with my brother instead of alone in that cave, wondering if you'd ever forgive me for the things I said in Canyon Springs. There's nothing to forgive, Silas replied, and was surprised to discover he meant it. We were both played by experts. The only villain in this story is lying dead in the snow over there. Thomas smiled, and for a moment he looked like the young man Silas remembered from their partnership days, quick to laugh, generous with trust, blessed with an easy way that made people warm to him instantly. You always were the smarter one. Brother, I just hope you're smart enough now to find some peace after all this. We'll find it together, Silas said, but Thomas was already shaking his head. No, we won't. But that's all right. I've had 48 years to make my peace with what happened between us. The only thing I regretted was thinking you'd never know the truth about Canyon Springs. Now you do, and that's enough. The wind picked up, stirring the snow around them and carrying the clean scent of pine and mountain air. In the distance, thunder nickered softly, as if calling for the return of familiar companions. The mountain afternoon was fading toward evening, painting the sky in shades of grey and pale gold. Thomas's grip on Silas's wrist was growing weaker, but his eyes remained clear and focused. Take care of Dusty for me. He's a good dog, and he deserves better than to be alone up here. I will, Silas promised, his throat tight with emotions he'd thought buried decades ago. And Silas, don't stay up here forever. You've got years left, good years. Don't waste them hiding from a world that needs men like you. Before Silas could respond, Thomas's eyes closed and his breathing became shallow and irregular. The brother he'd mourned for 48 years was finally truly leaving him, this time forever. Thomas Boone died as the sun touched the western peaks, his final breath carried away on the mountain wind like a whispered prayer. Silas sat beside his brother's body for a long time, one hand resting on Dusty's head, while the other held the leather journal that contained the truth about Canyon Springs. Around them, the debris field bore silent witness to the end of a conflict that had consumed nearly half a century. The silence felt different now, not the oppressive quiet of isolation, but the peaceful stillness that comes after a storm has finally passed. Edmund Carlyle's body lay where it had fallen, already being claimed by the mountain as snow began to dust his expensive coat. His surviving gunmen were scattered across the avalanche site, their weapons cold and their mission unfulfilled. The long campaign of revenge had ended not with triumph, but with the simple recognition that some wounds could only be healed by time and truth. When Silas finally stood, his knees protested the cold, and his shoulder burned where Morrison's bullet had grazed him. But these were minor complaints, the kind of aches that reminded a man he was still alive when others were not. He gathered Thomas's rifle and the remaining supplies, then whistled softly for thunder. The old horse picked his way carefully across the treacherous footing, as steady and reliable as he'd been through 20 years of shared adventures. The journey back to his cabin took twice as long as usual, partly because of the difficult terrain, but mostly because Silas found himself stopping frequently to look back at the place where his brother lay. He'd bury Thomas properly when the ground thawed in spring, but for now the mountain would have to serve as both grave marker and memorial. Dusty followed close at Thunder's heels, his usual enthusiasm replaced by a quiet grief that spoke to the depth of his bond with Thomas. The dog seemed to understand that his world had changed forever, that the warm cave and gentle hands that had cared for him through 12 winters were gone. But he also seemed to sense that he wasn't alone, that the tall man who smelled of gunpowder and sorrow would take care of him now. The cabin felt different when they arrived, as full darkness settled over the bitter ridge. What had been Silas's private sanctuary for 15 years now felt like a place meant for sharing, as if Thomas's presence lingered in the shadows and corners. Silas built up the fire, prepared a simple meal, and set out food and water for Dusty, all the while thinking about his brother's final words. "Don't stay up here forever," Thomas had said. "You've got years left, good years. Don't waste them hiding from a world that needs men like you." The advice was sound, but putting it into practice would require more courage than facing Carlyle's guns. Silas had built his mountain refuge as much to escape the world as to escape his grief. The thought of returning to civilization, of explaining where he'd been and why he'd chosen isolation, seemed almost overwhelming. Yet as he sat by the fire, with Dusty sleeping at his feet, Silas found himself thinking about the towns he'd known in his bounty hunting days. Places where honest law was scarce and good men were always needed. Perhaps there was still work to be done for someone with his skills and experience, even at his age. He opened Thomas's journal and began reading by firelight, learning details about Catherine's mission that painted an even darker picture of Carlyle's methodical revenge. The railroad man had spent years assembling dossiers on everyone connected to the Boone brothers, planning their destruction with the same attention to detail he'd once applied to building rail lines across hostile territory. But there were other documents in the collection Thomas had preserved, evidence of Carlyle's crimes that went far beyond embezzlement. Bribes to territorial officials, the systematic harassment of competitors, even connections to several mysterious deaths among his business rivals. The man Silas had killed today had been far